Shalom, this is Levi Shore. Welcome back to Sweet and Good Torah. So when I was a kid, I really loved reading science fiction books, and one of the books that really had a big impact on me was the book Dune. So I thought it would be interesting. There's a new movie coming out in a month or so. If we took the character of Paul Atreides and we showed how there's aspects of Moshiach in that character, I thought it would be a lot of fun. Okay, I hope you enjoy it. So it was written. Dune was written by Frank Herbert in 1965. And most of the action takes place on this planet called Arrakis, which is like this desert planet. And it's kind of represents like the Middle East. It's like the deserty region of the Middle East, especially like Eretz Yisrael. And it's ignored by this vast like galactic empire for the most part. But there's something very important that's produced on the planet Arrakis, and it's this spice melange. So it's interesting. So the spice melange, it extends a person's life, so it's very valuable to people, and then it enhances like a person's mental abilities. And there's obvious analogy like in the spice to oil and the kind of the geopolitical situation in the modern world, how all these nations are fighting over the resources of oil, and especially like the oil, especially in the 60s, 70s, the main source of oil was coming from the Middle East. I think it's now found like more commonly around the world. And so I want to use like the book Dune to use a mushal to the Torah, to compare the spice to the Torah, where the Torah is like the tree of life. The Torah is the Eitz Chaim, and through learning Torah and doing the mitzvahs, a person can extend their life, and they can extend their life in this world, and then they can it helps a person prepare for the life in Olam Haba, the world that's coming. So Olam Haba is there's a concept of heaven in the Western world. There, a person dies, he's good, he goes to heaven. But Olam Haba, it's a little different concept. There is spiritual worlds of the Shemayims, there are the heavens, the spiritual worlds of above. But the concept of Olam Haba is not that a person dies and just goes to one of these spiritual worlds, but to actually that through our actions, through the Torah and the mitzvahs, we're transforming this world, the world we live in, planet Earth. We're transforming that world into the world that come, and we're going to take these spiritual worlds, and they're going to come back down into this world, and that's the state of Gan Eden. That's like the Garden of Eden state. So that's the goal. So, and we see that we put the Torah scroll away. We say Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. It says that the Torah itself is the tree of life for those who grasp it. So then there's this thing called the Guild, the Space Guild. And there's these guild navigators, and they use the spice to give them kind of like a multi-dimensional awareness, and that helps them navigate like interstellar space. So the Torah teaches us the halacha, and it teaches us like how to walk like on the Derek Hashem, like how to walk on this path towards Olam Haba. And the Torah can help a person acquire an expanded consciousness. There's a state called like in the Kabbalah, it's called like the Mochin Gadlus, like the expanded consciousness, the grown up consciousness, like the Mochin Katnus, like the childlike consciousness, is where we're caught up, just in the physical world and all the desires of the physical world, and we're very much like children, like, oh, I want this, I want that, I didn't get it, I'm upset. But the Mochin Gadlus is when we start getting a more ruchnius, expanded consciousness view of the world, where we get out of ourselves, we start thinking of other people and how we can give, and what goodness we can do, what good we can do to other people. And that's the more grown up consciousness. It's the consciousness of like when a parent's raising, the child, and the parent puts his desires, on the back burner, and then it's like, what is the needs of, my kids? And it's more grown up, expanded consciousness. So through the Torah, like a person can actually, they can reach this state of like Ruach HaKodesh. They can earn Ruach HaKodesh. The book Mesilas Yesharim, written by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, it explains the steps, the spiritual growth, and the steps that a person has to go through to acquire the state of Ruach HaKodesh. And Ruach HaKodesh is it's described as divine like inspiration, where like Hashem gives you, He sends you like ideas and thoughts and elevated insights into things, and you have more of like this expanded consciousness, more clarity of life, and you kind of receive that from Hashem. And then the higher level than that is Nevuah, it's prophecy, where the Nevi'im, the prophets, they would go into this meditative state, and then they would go higher and higher into the spiritual worlds that we talked about a little earlier before, and then they would get outside, they would break outside of the physical constraints of time and space, so they could have visions like of the future, visions of the past. They would get insight from Hashem. They would get insight from this infinite being by attaching themselves closer and closer to this infinite being, to Hashem. And they would have vast vision of things that were going to happen, and Hashem would give them information about things that would happen in the future. And that's kind of like this expanded consciousness that through the Torah, for doing the mitzvahs, for refining our midos, like improving our personal character traits. Like a person can rise higher and higher in spirituality and ruchnius, and they can really break out of our physical limitations. So it's interesting. So in Dune, Arrakis is the only source of spice. The only place in the universe to get this spice that has all these amazing qualities is Arrakis. And it's interesting because Eretz Yisrael, especially Jerusalem, is really the place where Torah goes out into the world. And we see in the Nevuah of Yeshaya, Perek Beis, Pasuk Gimel, it's Isaiah 2nd chapter, the 3rd verse, and he says, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. From Zion, and Zion is the name of the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount where the temple stood. From there, from where the temple will be, the Torah goes out. Udavar Hashem Yerushalayim, and the word of Hashem goes out from Jerusalem. So we see that Eretz Yisrael, especially Jerusalem, and especially the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount, where the temple will be built, Bezrat Hashem, it's a special place where the Torah goes out to the whole world. And so here's a little bit of the plot of Dune. So there was this guy, the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. He was the emperor of this galactic empire, and he appoints Duke Leto Atreides, the fief ruler of Arrakis, and they replaced the House Atreides, replaced their enemies, House Harkonnen, and House Harkonnen was led by Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, or however you pronounce it. So it's interesting. So it sounds to me that the Padishah Emperor Shaddam, to me it sounds like Persian, and I don't know Frank Herbert's exact intention, but the Atreides, their names they sound like Greek, so it's almost like maybe he had an idea of Paul Atreides was kind of this Alexander the Great, this philosopher king, kind of ruler, this young ruler that conquers the empire, that conquers the Persian Empire maybe. We'll look how this fits into the Torah, but that may have been, that's my impression of maybe what Frank Herbert's intention was. I don't know exactly. I never read exactly why he picked this dynamic. So then it's interesting that the Harkonnens they're the ultimate villains, and their colors of their house are red. So it kind of it's an obvious analogy in the Torah to Edom, to the the Roman Empire, the Western powers, and then I think there was also an aspect of Vladimir Harkonnen that Frank Herbert was putting them in the dynamic of the Russians, and this is written in the Cold War. So maybe the Atreides are the Americans, and the Harkonnens are the Russians. So there's a little bit of that dynamic also. So the Baron, he indulges in just all kinds of illicit relations. So I think in 2000 they made a TV mini-series on Dune, and I'll talk about how much I hated David Lynch's, I think it was 1984 or somewhere around there. David Lynch made this film adaptation. I don't know, you can write your comments if you like David Lynch's adaptation or not. I read something interesting from Frank Herbert after the movie, David Lynch's movie came out, and he said, and Frank Herbert said, he wrote a story about a man pretending to be a god, whereas he felt like David Lynch's movie was a movie about a god pretending to be a man. I thought that was a pretty interesting insight from Frank Herbert. Didn't sound like he loved the movie either, but so let's see. We'll try to get back on track here. So and then the Baron Harkonnen, he just indulges. So just like Esav, just like Yaakov's twin brother Esav, Jacob's brother Esau, this character, the Baron Harkonnen, just indulges every like illicit, like physical desire, and he just eats so much, and he's like so large that he literally needs like he needs like technology to help him move. Like I think he flies around in this like chair, and he needs like stuff to help him get around, and it's just like so huge, just so overindulged, kind of like Jabba the Hutt somewhat, just overindulged in all the physical desires of the world. And he was very much like a Roman emperor, and he also had no children. There was no royal marriage there, and he just had like these two nephews, Glasu Bis Raban, and then the more cunning nephew Fade Rafa. And so there's no family there. It's just like almost like the succession of like a Roman emperor to like a nephew or an adopted nephew. Maybe they were adopted nephews. And and the Baron is just very much like Asa, just like overindulging in all the pleasures of this world. So then the story goes on that the Baron captures the wife of Duke Leto's personal physician, Dr. Wellington Huey, and he had this imperial conditioning, which was supposed to be really hard to break. But by capturing Dr. Huey's wife, he made Dr. Huey into a traitor, and then Dr. Huey betrays the Duke. He betrays Duke Leto. He like drugs him, and he hands him over to the Baron. And there was like this invasion of Arrakis by House Harkonnen, and then Dr. Huey helps Paul and his mother, the Bene Gesserit Lady Jessica, and we'll talk about them briefly or soon. And they escape into the desert. So then Paul and Jessica, they find the Fremen, these desert people that live on Arrakis, and they go to the Sich Tabar. So it's interesting. That's kind of like the Arabic like way of saying it, but Tabar, I think it's related to like in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, it's like Tabor, like Har Tabor, Mount Tabor, and Tabor is like means like the belly button, but it means like the middle. The middle of the body, like the exact middle. So Eretz Yisrael is sometimes called like the Tabor HaOlam, like it's like the exact middle of the world. It's the essence of the world. So this was the Fremen. This was like their most important sitch. So they had these like caves because it was just so hot and windy, and those sandstorms and these giant worms, and they just wanted to be out of that mess. So they lived in these caves, and they made these huge communities. These sitches in the caves where it was cool, out of the desert heat. So the Fremen are interesting. So I think he was implying like they were free men. So I'm not quite sure if he was going for that like Western Enlightenment, like Freemason kind of thing with them. But they resemble Islam. They definitely are Islam. They're very much like they're Muslims in their attitudes and their customs. And the Fremen are expecting a Messiah named the Mahdi, which is the Islamic word for the Messiah, and then Paul takes this Fremen name, like they join the tribe, and he takes a Fremen name of like Ma'dib, which is like this desert mouse, and that name's very similar. It's very close to Mahdi, so they start to already think that Paul is like their Moshiach, their Messiah. So now the Bene Gesserit, very strange. I did not like them. This very evil group, very manipulative. And it's interesting. So here, for whatever reason, Frank Herbert chose a lot of like Hebrew-sounding names, but we'll really see how like they're really quite different. But B'nai Gesserit, I don't know how he pronounced it, but it seems like he was almost saying B'nai Gesher. Like I'm not sure if that's where he was going, but it would be like the children of the bridge. And they were kind of this sisterhood, this order, the sisterhood. And they were kind of engaged in this like genetic engineering with the bloodlines of the aristocracy, and they were trying to like breed a Messiah, what they called the Kwitzak Chadarak, which means like the shortening of the way. And I think that's very close to the Hebrew word Katsas Haderech, like cutting down the way, shortening the way. And they had this like voice, like it was kind of like a Jedi mind trick where they control people. It wasn't as nice as in Star Wars, where it's like Obi-Wan's like, these are not the droids you're looking for. These are not the droids you're looking for. It was like very like controlling people. It was very manipulative. And then they would manipulate people with like this with their own religious mythologies. And I think this is very much like what Avodah Zarah is, what idol worship is, what all man-made religions are. As opposed to the Torah, it's like it manipulates people with fears and mythology, and they call this manipulation. They call it missionaria protectiva, like missionary protection. I don't know. So it's protection for their order, but they were manipulating people with like religion or religions they were making up. And then they had this like martial arts fighting technique called the weirding way, and it was like martial arts training of like prana bindu. And I think, and then they had this like also mental powers, but like, so prana is a Sanskrit word for breath or like life force, and bindu is Sanskrit for point. And then they supposedly like had complete control over their bodies. Like they control every muscle and they can control their internal organs. And we see that like the Reverend Mother, like she was mad at Lady Jessica for not having a daughter. Like they had total control over if they were going to have a son or a daughter, and they were manipulating these bloodlines, and they wanted this daughter to marry the Harkonnens, and then they thought they would get their Messiah, but Lady Jessica defies them, and then you see how all the events unfold. And I don't know, it's all very strange, but I think this is so funny because like this is completely, even they're using all these Hebrew sounding words, this is completely opposite to how Jewish women are. And I don't know if these B'nai Gesserit were supposed to be Jewish. I mean, they're kind of like nuns, but I don't know, they're concubines. It's very strange. But like Jewish women, they raise children with like love and kindness, and they fill the home with delicious food and warmth. And Moshiach, one of the things that's going to really bring Moshiach, it's going to come from the modesty and the kindness of the Jewish women. And it helped us really get out of Mitzrayim. It helped us get out of Egypt. And teaching good midos, teaching good character traits and derech eretz, good behavior to the children, and just a love for learning. And Mashiach is going to lead the world down the derech Hashem, not cut the path, but lead the people on the path and learning how to come closer to Hashem, how to come closer and feel connected to this infinite creator, this infinite being. So it's interesting. So this is all kind of very opposite of like Mashiach. So then there's this whole thing with like these sandworms produce the spice, and if they put the little sandworms in water, it produces this almost like poison thing that they call the water of life. So Lady Jessica, she drinks the water of life, and then that transforms her into this Reverend Mother, and it gives her more mental powers or whatever powers. And then she was pregnant at the time with Leah, and then this little Leah, who was a baby, gains the same powers. And then Paul Atreides, he marries this girl Chani, who was the daughter of the planetologist Liet Kynes, and he married a Fremen wife named Farola. So Paul also, at some point in the story, he drinks the water of life, and he survives, and then he gains the power of like what they call the Kwitzak Haderach, or so he becomes like the Messiah figure. And then he gains vision, like outside of like time and space. Like so, he gains like their version of prophecy, like Frank Herbert's version of prophecy. And the difference is like Nevuah. So it was kind of like a internal power that he possessed in the book that gave him the power to just see outside time and space. But in the Torah, it's very different. It's like Nevuah, prophecy, is we're receiving information, receiving a communication from Hashem. So we can get a glimpse outside in time and space, but it's not an internal power. It's like we kind of like we make ourselves smaller, or we back off our ego, like we lessen our ego, so we're able to receive like a message from Hashem, and it's just like so the highest level of Torah is called Kabbalah, which means receiving. So the goal is like we keep like becoming more giving, more kind people, more in control. Like Gevurah, we have self-control, and it's just these steps we go higher and higher in these spiritual levels, these spiritual madregas. So a person reaches this state of Nevuah, they're very calm and still, and they can receive like these messages beyond the physical limitations of time and space. So, okay, so then finally, we'll start to get to the end here. So we mentioned like Chani's father was this planetologist named Liet Kynes. And he had this vision of, just from a science, planetology, like ecological, that he wanted to make this desert planet, he wanted to make it bloom, he wanted to make it fertile and green. And so the Fremen like loved his vision, and in their sitches, in their underground caves, they had these wind traps, and they would catch the moisture from the air, and then they would start like making these vast pools of water that were collected in their sitches, and then the goal was at some point they would start planting and start backing off the desert, and then eventually make the planet bloom and make it be green. So this is interesting. So I think this fits in well to Torah, because the Torah is compared to mayim, it's compared to water, and eventually when Moshiach comes, the real Moshiach, when the real king, return, Hashem sends the king to Eretz Yisrael. We have a king in Jerusalem. Like he's going to teach us the Torah again, like on the level like we knew it from Moshe Rabbeinu, like when we learned it from Moses, and even beyond, like even a higher gate of wisdom we've never even learned yet. And when the Jewish people are fully back in Eretz Yisrael, immersed in the Torah, doing the mitzvahs, doing Gemil Chasadim, acts of kindness, the land's just going to bloom. I know it's like it's returned a little bit since like the Jewish people are returned, but it's going to really be as rich and fertile as like Europe and America, and just beautiful and beyond that. And Eretz Yisrael is going to reach its full potential, and it's going to return to the state of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden was actually in that special place we were talking about before, on the Har HaBayis where the temple was. That's where the Eitz Chaim was. That's where the Tree of Life was. And that's where the Aron HaKodesh, was placed in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies of the temple. And that was the place where the Shemayim touches the Aretz, where the spiritual flow from Hashem, the Shefa, comes into the physical world from the spiritual worlds. And it's just, we're going to see the full potential of the world. And it's going to begin in Eretz Yisrael, and it's going to spread to the whole world. And it's that beautiful idea of turning the desert into literally like the Garden of Eden, which means Gan Eden means the garden of pleasure, the garden of delights. And we're going to see it, and then we're going to see the full potential where Hashem put a potential in the world we haven't even seen yet, that you have trees that don't produce fruit, and there'll be every kind of tree will produce fruits that we've never even seen before. So we'll see a higher potential for the world. And we see this in the Nevuah of Yechezkel and Ezekiel in chapter 47, verse 8. And it says like underneath the Har HaBayis, underneath where the third temple, and the third temple is built, there's going to be this one mighty river. I think one river goes to the east and one goes to the west. And this is describing the river that goes to the east. And it says these waters go out to the Galila Kadmona. I think it means like the ancient Galil, which is talking about the Dead Sea area. That's the Galil where the Kinneret is, the Sea of Galilee, and that descends to the Arava, the dried area, which is the Dead Sea, and come to the sea, to the spreading sea, which is the Red Sea. And then the water will become healthy, and it means like the Dead Sea, it's so salty, like no life can be sustained there. That was where Sodom and Gomorrah was, Sodom and Amorah, and the five rich cities that used to be one of the richest agricultural areas in Israel before it was cursed with all this salt. But it's going to become sweetened again with this river that's going to flow out of the temple, and the Dead Sea is going to be filled, it says, with as much sea life as like the Mediterranean Sea, and then it may even spread out further into the ocean and sweeten the ocean of the saltiness, and it's just going to be this amazing thing. And then, just as we said, that Torah is compared to water, that the Torah is going to go out from Yerushalayim, and it's going to go out to the whole world, and then all the world is going to receive the great wisdom of the Torah. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you back again soon on Sweet and Good Torah.